What if the most dangerous war of this decade didn't end with a bigger bomb, but with silence? For 13 nights in a row, American aircraft lit up the skies over Iran. Then, without warning, without a single press conference, without the president himself stepping in front of a camera to explain it, the bombs simply stopped falling. Before I explain why that silence might be more dangerous than the bombing itself, do one thing for me right now. Hit like on this video, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear is not speculation, and it is not guesswork. It is happening this week, right now, while most of the world is looking somewhere else, and by the end of this video, you will understand this war better than almost anyone scrolling past the headlines today. Let's start with exactly where things stand, because the picture shifted fast, and a lot of people watching the news casually have completely missed the turn. For close to 2 weeks, the United States carried out one of the most sustained military campaigns against a single country that we have seen in years. Night after night, American aircraft and missiles struck targets across Iranian territory. Officials have pointed to a target list of more than 300 sites, 13 consecutive nights of strikes, one after another, an operational tempo that most modern wars never reach and rarely sustain for that long. Then, on a Friday night, it simply stopped. No announcement of new strikes, no declaration of victory, no explanation offered to the public, just quiet. A Defense Department source told reporters that operations were, in their exact words, on a hold. Not ended, not concluded, not canceled, on a hold. Sit with that phrase for a second, because it is doing a lot of work. A hold is not peace. A hold is a pause with an invisible clock attached to it. And nobody outside a small circle of officials knows exactly how long that clock is set to run. The real question, the one almost nobody is asking clearly enough, is this: why did the most powerful military machine on the planet suddenly go quiet at the exact moment it looked like it was building towards something even bigger? To answer that, you need to understand how this war actually got here, because none of this happened overnight, and none of it happened by accident. Rewind to the summer of last year. Israel and Iran fought a brutal 12-day war, a conflict that shook the region and pulled in outside powers almost immediately. It ended with something the modern world had never actually witnessed before. The United States directly struck Iran's nuclear infrastructure, hitting the enrichment facilities that Tehran had spent decades quietly building and defending. For the first time in history, an American president ordered a direct military strike on another nation's nuclear weapons program. It was a line that arms control experts, diplomats, and military planners had talked about for years as a threshold that once crossed could never be uncrossed. A ceasefire followed that strike. A memorandum of understanding was signed between Washington and Tehran, laying out a 60-day window, a narrow opportunity to turn a fragile pause into something resembling a lasting settlement. Anyone who has studied conflict resolution will tell you that these windows are almost always the most fragile part of any war. They look like peace from a distance, but up close, they are usually just exhaustion wearing peace clothing. That window did not hold. Talks that were supposed to open in Switzerland at a resort, meant to host quiet technical negotiations between the two sides, were called off before they even began. Trust between Washington and Tehran, thin to begin with after decades of hostility, kept eroding week after week. By the spring of this year, strikes on Iran's nuclear sites had already resumed. Iran's own state media confirmed that Natanz, one of its most important enrichment complexes, was struck again in March. Through the months that followed, tensions kept climbing. Each side testing the other, each side calculating how far it could push without triggering the E kind of full-scale war that nobody publicly at least claimed to want. By the middle of this July, all of that slow escalation had turned into something that looked very much like open war. Again, the United States was conducting strikes on Iran almost every single night. Iran and the armed groups aligned with it were hitting back across the wider region, from military bases to commercial shipping to allied nations sitting in the crossfire. That was the world we were living in just 10 days ago. A campaign that had grown so large, so relentless, so sustained night after night that it had started to resemble a full air war rather than a limited punitive strike. And it is precisely that scale, precisely that unsustainable intensity that forced the decision which changed everything this past weekend. Here's what actually happened behind closed doors based on accounts multiple officials have given directly to journalists. On a Friday, President Trump sat down with his most senior political and military advisors inside the White House. He was weighing something enormous, something far beyond the scope of the strikes already underway. Multiple sources describe it plainly as consideration of a massive escalation, a dramatically larger assault than anything the campaign had attempted so far. Reporting describes plans that reportedly included widening strikes to hit energy infrastructure directly, coastal radar and air defense installations, and even discussion of a possible move to land forces near Karg Island, one of the most important oil export terminals belonging to Iran anywhere in the country. Stop and actually picture what that would have meant. Not a strike on a nuclear facility buried under a mountain. Not a strike on a military command center. An assault aimed squarely at the economic lifeline of an entire nation, and quite possibly a ground component physically present on Iranian soil for the first time in this entire conflict. That is not an escalation in the normal sense of the word. That is the opening of an entirely different war. One with a completely different set of risks, a completely different set of casualties, and a completely different ending. And in that room, at that exact moment, two of the most powerful men inside the American national security system pushed back against it. If a video like this is helping you actually understand what is happening in the world, instead of just reacting to whatever headline crosses your feed, do me a favor right now. Share it with one person, someone who keeps asking you what is really going on with Iran and never gets a straight answer back. That one share is what keeps a channel like this able to keep doing this kind of deep, careful work, instead of chasing whatever gets the most panic-driven clicks. Now let's talk about who exactly pushed back in that room and why their objection matters more than almost anything else you will hear about this war today. Vice President Jay Dance raised concerns about escalating the conflict any further, and General Dan Caney, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the single most senior uniformed officer in the entire United States military, raised a warning that is rarely spoken about so openly and almost never leaked to the public this quickly. According to the sources who described that meeting, General Caney told the room that the United States could in fact carry out the larger operation. He did not say it was impossible. He said it could be done, and it could likely succeed on its own terms. But then he laid out in front of the president exactly what it would cost the country to do it. That cost was not measured only in dollars, though the dollars alone are staggering. It was measured in interceptors, in missiles, in stockpiles that exist specifically to protect American troops, allied nations, and global shipping lanes from retaliation. General Caney specifically flagged deep concern about the Patriot air defense interceptor supply, the very system that has been shielding bases and cities and tankers throughout this entire war. Here's a number that should genuinely stop you for a moment and make you rethink the scale of what's actually happening. By this spring, the Pentagon had already fired more than 1,200 Patriot missiles in this conflict alone. 1,200. Each one of those interceptors cost more than $4 million. Do the simple math on that for a second. That is not a rounding error buried somewhere in a defense budget spreadsheet. That is a hemorrhage, a sustained invisible drain on one of the most critical defensive systems America owns. And that count was recorded months ago before the most intense stretch of nightly strikes had even taken place. Layer on top of that the additional consumption from years of supporting Ukraine's war against Russia and the ongoing fight against Houthi forces in Yemen, and a much bigger picture starts to come into focus. America's stockpile of some of its most important defensive weapons has been drawn down from multiple directions at the exact same time, and Iran is only one front among several competing for the exact same limited supply. This is the part of the story that almost nobody covers when they talk about this war, and it is arguably the most important part of all. Wars are not only won or lost through courage or political will or public support, they are constrained quietly and mercilessly by inventory. You cannot fire a weapon you do not have. You cannot intercept a missile with an interceptor that is sitting in a warehouse 3 oceans away, waiting to be manufactured. And when the single most senior military officer in the country stands in front of the sitting president and says plainly, "We can win this specific fight, but we may not have enough interceptors left afterward to properly defend ourselves," that is not hesitation, that is not weakness, that is arithmetic. Dressed in a military uniform and delivered as a direct warning. The United States ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, was sent out across the following weekend to explain all of this to the public, and he did something fairly unusual for someone in his position. He did not deny the stockpile problem outright. He acknowledged it directly on national television, saying plainly that a lot of stockpiles are depleted. He pointed to years of munitions sent to support Ukraine and separately to the drawdown caused by the extended fight against the Houthi in Yemen. And in the very same breath, he insisted that the United States still has everything it needs to continue this campaign in Iran if the president chooses to. Notice the tension sitting inside that one statement. Stockpiles are depleted and yet everything needed remains available. Both of those things are being presented as true at once. And that contradiction, whether you call it careful diplomatic phrasing or simple political spin, is exactly the space this entire pause is currently living inside. So the strikes stopped. But in any war, stopping strikes is rarely ever really about stopping. It is almost always about buying time. And the real question becomes time for what exactly and for whom. The official framing coming out of Washington is that this pause exists to give diplomacy a genuine chance to breathe. Waltz described it publicly as giving talks some space to develop. A senior administration official told reporters that the president's stated preference has always been diplomacy first, but that he wanted Iran to see clearly and concretely what would happen if it refused to come to the table in a serious way. In other words, the pause is being presented, at least publicly, as a form of pressure. Stop the bombs for now, but leave the threat of even more devastating bombs clearly visible on the table and see whether that pressure is enough to push Tehran toward a real negotiation. There's only one significant problem with that version of events. Iran is not telling the same story at all. If you have made it this far into the video, you already care more about actually understanding this conflict than most people who scroll past a headline and move on. So, let's keep going together, because the next part of this story is where things get genuinely uncomfortable and where a lot of mainstream coverage simply stops looking closely enough. Iran's foreign ministry held a televised press conference this week, and the spokesperson did not sound like a government quietly preparing to sit down at a negotiating table. He stated plainly that there are no talks currently underway with the United States. Not pause talks, not talks in preparation behind the scenes. No talks at all. He went further still, saying that Tehran will never allow the United States to determine the timing of war and peace on its behalf. He placed responsibility for the entire military confrontation squarely on Washington's shoulders, describing it openly as aggression that Iran holds America directly accountable for. He did not stop there either. He specifically singled out European allies of the United States, including France and the United Kingdom, accusing them of what he called complicity with the aggressor. He said Iran had expected the new British government to act more wisely than the one that came before it. This is not the language of a country quietly preparing to compromise behind closed doors. This is the language of a government deliberately drawing lines in public for its own citizens and for the watching world, making unmistakably clear that whatever peace eventually arrives will have to look like something Iran can present at home as a victory, not something that looks like surrender wrapped in diplomatic language. So here is the honest picture laid out plainly. Washington says this pause exists to give space for negotiation. Tehran says there's no negotiation happening at all anywhere right now. Both statements can technically be true at the exact same time. That overlap, that contradiction sitting quietly underneath the surface, is precisely what makes this moment so unstable. A pause that each side is interpreting through a completely different lens is not a foundation you can build peace on. It is a shared silence in which each side is quietly rearming, repositioning, and watching closely to see who blinks first. There is one place, however, where something resembling real functioning diplomacy is actually happening, and it deserves your full attention because it reveals what this entire war is truly about underneath all the missiles and the political statements. Iranian and Omani officials have been meeting directly inside Tehran, specifically to discuss shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign ministry has been careful, almost deliberately careful, to frame these particular talks as strictly bilateral, a conversation purely between two coastal nations about managing safe passage through shared waters and explicitly unrelated to the United States or the wider war. Why does that distinction matter so much? Because the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a narrow strip of blue water on a map somewhere far away. It is one of the single most important choke points for global energy transport on the entire planet. A staggering share of the world's seaborne oil passes through that narrow channel every single day, feeding economies on every continent. Whenever tensions rise in this region, the very first thing global markets watch closely is not troop movements or political speeches. It is tanker traffic quietly moving or failing to move through Hormuz, and markets have been watching very closely indeed. During this pause in direct fighting, the global price of oil actually dropped by more than 6%, settling down around $90 a barrel. Read that carefully because it tells you something important. Prices did not spike during a supposed ceasefire, the way you might expect fear-driven markets to behave. They fell. That single detail tells you something significant about how fragile, how closely monitored, and how deeply uncertain this entire standoff genuinely is. Global markets are not pricing in real peace here. They are pricing in a temporary exhale, a brief moment where the immediate threat to shipping eased just enough for traders to relax slightly while fully expecting, almost assuming that this calm could reverse at any moment without warning. If you were starting to notice just how many moving pieces are actually connected inside this one conflict, oil markets, missile stockpiles, diplomatic statements, military strategy sessions inside the White House, then you already understand exactly why a channel like this one exists. If you have not subscribed yet, now is a genuinely good moment to do it, because we are going to keep tracking every single one of these threads as they move. Not just whatever headline happens to be trending today. Now let's zoom all the way out, because this was never really just a two-country conflict. And the pause in direct strikes on Iranian territory has done almost nothing to calm the wider region surrounding it. While the skies directly over Iran have gone quiet for the moment, the fighting connected to this broader war has continued in multiple places at once, often far from the cameras following the main story. Iran-backed Houthi forces in Yemen launched an attack that struck a fuel refinery inside Saudi Arabia, setting it ablaze. This was not a minor border skirmish easily brushed aside. It marked the first direct attack on Saudi oil infrastructure in 4 full years. A Patriot missile battery, operated by a Greek crew as part of a coalition air defense effort, intercepted additional Houthi drones, and missiles fired toward another Saudi port city, one that handles the overwhelming majority of the kingdom's entire seaborne crude oil exports. This particular attack was itself described publicly as retaliation for earlier Saudi-led coalition strikes against Houthi positions elsewhere in Yemen. Do you see the pattern quietly forming here? Even while the central storyline, the direct American campaign against Iran, sits officially paused, the machinery of this wider war keeps grinding forward through allies and proxies scattered across the region. Saudi oil terminals under threat for the first time in years. Yemen rebel groups launching drones at some of the most important energy infrastructure on the entire planet. This is what a genuinely regional war looks like when the center goes quiet, but the edges keep burning steadily underneath. And then there is a thread almost nobody expected to see tangled into a Middle Eastern war. And yet here it is, unmistakably real. Iran has accused Ukraine of carrying out a long-range strike that killed a sailor aboard an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea, thousands of miles from the front lines most people associate with the Ukraine war. President Zelensky, meanwhile, has stated publicly that Russia passed satellite imagery of Gulf states and American military facilities in the region directly to Thrawn. 2 entirely separate wars, one raging in the Middle East and one grinding on in Eastern Europe, are now bleeding directly into each other through shared intelligence, retaliatory strikes, and overlapping alliances stretching thousands of miles apart. This is not a simple story anymore, if it ever truly was one. It is a web, intricate and constantly shifting. Iran, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the Houthis in Yemen, Israel, Russia, Ukraine, Oman is a quiet mediator, all connected through overlapping interests, decades-old grievances, and weapons supply chains that are all under simultaneous strain at the exact same moment in history. So where does all of this actually go from here? Let's talk honestly about what could realistically happen next. Because the honest answer, the one that respects your intelligence, is that nobody, not the sharpest analysts, not the officials sitting inside the White House, not the clerics governing from Tran, can tell you with genuine certainty which direction this conflict tips. The most immediate danger sitting underneath everything is this. If this pause was never truly about opening the door to peace and was instead primarily about buying time to rebuild depleted stockpiles of interceptors and munitions, then this quiet period carries an invisible expiration date built into it from the very beginning. Once stockpiles are sufficiently replenished, or once patience with slow-moving diplomacy simply runs out inside the White House, The underlying pressure to return to the larger campaign that was actively being discussed in that meeting does not simply disappear into thin air. It waits patiently in the background, fully capable of resurfacing the moment conditions allow it to. Remember exactly what was reportedly sitting on the table before Vance and Kane raised their direct objections in that room. Wider strikes reaching into energy infrastructure, coastal radar and air defense systems targeted directly, even serious discussion of a possible move on Carr Island, a location tied intimately to Iran's fundamental ability to export oil at all, its literal economic lifeline to the outside world. That plan was not canceled outright, at least not based on everything that has been reported so far. It was set aside for now, specifically because the military's own most senior leadership warned openly that carrying it out could leave the United States dangerously exposed on its own defenses in the process of executing it. Setting a plan aside is a fundamentally different thing from abandoning it completely and permanently. On the other side of this equation, Iran has made abundantly clear through its own public statements that it does not see itself as defeated and does not see itself as remotely ready to negotiate purely on terms dictated by Washington. A government that stands in front of television cameras and tells its own people that it will never let another country dictate when war ends and peace begins is a government actively positioning itself for a long, grinding confrontation, not a swift and tidy settlement. That kind of public rhetoric is never accidental. It is deliberately designed to prepare an entire population for continued hardship, not to prepare them for imminent relief. And underneath every single layer of this conflict sits the original reason this entire war restarted in the first place, Iran's nuclear program. Strikes carried out in the summer of last year and again this past March were aimed directly at slowing or permanently destroying that program's capabilities. Every account of the actual damage done has varied wildly depending on exactly who is speaking and what interest they might have in the answer. Some officials have described the destruction as severe, even permanent, and irreversible. Other assessments, including some that leaked from inside America's own intelligence community, described the damage as far more limited, suggesting the program had only been delayed by a matter of months rather than truly destroyed. When even a single country's own defense and intelligence agencies cannot fully agree with each other on how much real damage was actually done, that uncertainty itself becomes a powerful reason for renewed conflict down the road. Nobody fully trusts any single assessment, which means nobody can honestly claim the underlying threat has actually been eliminated. That is the fundamental trap. This entire war remains caught inside, and it is worth understanding clearly. You cannot be truly certain a nuclear threat has been eliminated without physically verifying it on the ground. You cannot verify it without independent inspectors and genuine cooperation from the country being inspected. And a country that has endured sustained bombardment for weeks at a time has very little practical incentive to voluntarily open its most sensitive and closely guarded military sites to outside verification in the middle of an active ongoing war. Destruction on one hand and confirmation of that destruction on the other are being pulled in exactly opposite directions at the exact same moment, and that tension has no easy resolution in sight. We are getting close to the end here, and I want to bring every one of these threads together because underneath everything we have walked through together, there is one central truth that deserves to be said plainly and directly. Before we get there, if this kind of grounded, carefully researched breakdown is genuinely something you want more of, tap that subscribe button right now because the next major update on this conflict could arrive at literally any moment, day or night. And I want you to be here the second it does, not scrambling to catch up somewhere else afterward. Here is the truth sitting at the center of all of this. A pause in bombing is never the same thing as an actual end to a war. It never has been in any conflict in any era of human history, going all the way back as far as recorded history allows us to look. What we are watching unfold right now is not peace quietly breaking out across the Middle East. It is a system under enormous strain, catching its breath for a moment before whatever comes next. The United States military, still the most powerful fighting force in the entire world, reached a genuine point where its own most senior officer had to stand directly in front of the commander-in-chief and say plainly and without flinching, "We can carry out this operation, but we may not be able to properly protect ourselves afterward. If we do, that is not weakness on display. That is what genuinely responsible power sounds like when it is being brutally honest with itself in a room where nobody else is watching. But it is also a warning sign that should not be ignored. Because a superpower forced to ration its own defensive stockpiles in the middle of a war it deliberately chose to escalate is a superpower operating far closer to its actual limits than most casual observers realize. On the other side of this standoff, a government sitting in Tran stood in front of its own television cameras and told its own people that no outside power on earth gets to decide when this war truly ends. That is not the language of a country quietly looking for a graceful exit ramp. It is the language of a country settling in psychologically for whatever comes next. Whether that turns out to be more negotiation, more sustained bombardment, or some uneasy combination of both happening simultaneously, sitting between those two positions is an entire region holding its collective breath. Oil tankers moving cautiously and nervously through the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi refineries recovering from a direct attack for the first time in 4 long years. Interceptor missiles being fired at more than $4 million apiece just to protect infrastructure that keeps the entire global economy running smoothly day to day. And a nuclear question sitting unresolved at the very center of it all. One that nobody, not officials in Washington, not clerics in Tehran, not the international agencies specifically created to monitor exactly this kind of threat, can currently answer with any real confidence. Wars do not typically end with one single dramatic moment that everyone instantly recognizes in real time as history unfolding. They end, or far more often, they escalate through a long series of quiet decisions made inside rooms most of us will never see by men and women weighing stockpiles and casualties and political survival against each other on scales the rest of us never get to examine directly. What happened this past week inside that White House meeting was exactly one of those quiet decisions. It did not generate the same kind of dramatic headlines that a missile strike naturally produces, but it may ultimately matter far more than any single bomb dropped during the last 2 weeks of active fighting, because it revealed something the entire watching world genuinely needed to see and understand clearly. Even the most powerful military machine on Earth has a real measurable limit. And right now, both sides of this deeply dangerous standoff are quietly betting that the other one will hit that limit first. Whether that bet ultimately ends in a genuine lasting peace or in the very escalation that was quietly shelved this past week, inside that room is a question that will not be answered by speeches or press conferences or carefully worded official statements. It will be answered by what actually happens the very next time the skies over Iran fall silent again. And whether that silence finally turns out to be the sound of a long war genuinely ending, or simply the quiet, patient sound of both sides reloading for whatever comes.